Good evening and welcome to this week's episode of Science Stream. Thank you for joining us live on Facebook. We hope you continue to stay safe and healthy during this pandemic. We'll be starting our broadcast shortly, so make yourself comfortable, and if you have any questions for our guests, feel free to leave your questions in the comment section. See you in a bit. Hello once again, especially to those who have just joined us. I'm Sean from Penang, Penang's very own Science Discovery Center. Movement Control Order, MCO, and its derivatives, put in place since March 18, have forced Malaysians indoors and away from family members, friends, and colleagues, as well as impacting other social aspects of Malaysians. Dr. Matt Benson, the Program Director for Urban Solutions of Think City, designed a truly Malaysian community survey in May to get a feel of how Malaysians fared during MCO, titled Okay or Not During MCO. Matt is an Australian geographer specializing in complex systems and human settlements. Over the past 25 years, he has been involved in a range of projects, including constructed wetlands, main street redevelopments, resettlements, big data analytics, population modeling, and national policies. Matt is currently a program director for Think City and is based in Penang, Malaysia. Please join me to welcome Dr. Matt Benson to the show.
Welcome. Good evening, Sean.
Good evening. Welcome to Science Stream, Matt. Thank you for being here. Doing great. Hope you are doing great as well. Okay or not okay?
Okay lah.
So, how long have you been in Penang, Matt?
Well, actually, I've been visiting and connection to Penang for more than 20 years, actually. I actually studied at USM in 1996 for a year. So I've had a relationship with Penang for many decades, actually. So I've lived here, gone back to Australia, come back to Penang, but I've been based here permanently for nearly 8 years at the moment. So it's definitely home for me.
So do you plan to return back to Australia, or Penang is definitely your home already?
Well, Penang is definitely my home, but you know, one never knows what the future holds, right?
All right. So let's go to the survey. What was the purpose of the Okay or Not During MCO survey?
Well, as all of you know, mid-March, the Malaysian government announced that it was going into what they called a movement control order, which essentially was a lockdown, which is the language that we used. And the reason that they did that was to what they call flatten the curve. At that time, the infection rates for COVID-19 was starting to spike. And, you know, good public health practice is to try to get that peak down and to make sure that it's under what they call the health system's capacity. So essentially it was to allow the Malaysian government to buy time to slow the rate of infections. And I think that has been successfully achieved. So my recollection is that it went into lockdown on the 18th of March, and it was lifted some 46 days later. We went into a conditional movement control order for another month or so. So Malaysians have been, and now we're just moving into the recovery mode. So Malaysians have been in some form of restricted movement for some time, essentially for a long period, stuck at home. Many people unable to go out. Only at one point, only one family member was able to go out and get food. And I think if you looked at the data of late, you will see that the curve has been flattened. I mean, thanks to the efforts of the Malaysian government, really thanks to the efforts of the Malaysian people. So given that that was a quite extreme event for most of the world, but you know, for Malaysians, we thought that it was useful to get a bit of an insight into how well Malaysians fared during the lockdown. So the aim of the survey was to understand how the MCO affected people against different types of criteria. And we thought it was an important moment in Malaysian history to get some historical data that we could use at some point in the future, sort of benchmark against the baseline, if you like, just after the MCO is lifted.
So the survey was very Malaysianized. Please elaborate your methodology and why did you use this approach?
Okay, so in my world, we do a lot of surveys, and I'm very mindful of something called survey fatigue. Yeah, so it's this. People get fed up with filling out long surveys. They get fed up with boring surveys. They get fed up with the same old, same old. So we realized that in order to get some meaningful data, we had to do something a little bit different. So we came up with this idea of a Malaysianized approach. Yeah. So the questions, when we had an English and a Malay version, but the English version in particular combined, well, it was basically how Malaysians speak, right? So it combined a little bit of English with a little bit of with Malay type of thing. So you can see here a couple of examples here of that. So the idea was that it was a little bit of humor thrown into it as well. So we just wanted to make it a bit more interesting. Hopefully people had a bit of a laugh along the way. And then the other thing that we were fortunate is able to do is we're able to get Dato' Lat to choose some of these cartoons, that were appropriate for the situation, just to add a little bit more spice to the survey. So that was the approach to the actual the okay or not survey.
Yeah, and I enjoy reading his comics. It really captures the Malaysian life.
Yeah, we also offered I think we gave away 20 cartoon of these original books to people that entered completed the survey.
So it was a lucky draw?
Yes, it was a lucky draw. A little bit more of a sweetener for people to complete the survey.
So can you explain Maslow's hierarchy of needs for those of us who are not familiar with what this is?
Sure. So when we were thinking about the impact of MCO on people, we figured, from our own personal experience, there were some very basic things where people may have suffered from, ability to pay the rent, etc., through to their relationships with their family, and in some cases, people's spiritual needs. So we thought that maybe we might like to structure it around something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is a really old diagram. It actually comes from the 1940s, and it still has currency today in psychological and sociological circles. So the premise here is that at the very bottom of this pyramid is what we call the basic or physiological needs, right? This is your food, water, shelter type of things, yeah? And then as you move through the 5 degrees of the hierarchy, you move to something that's a bit more about your potential and your self-esteem, yeah? The second layer there is about safety and security. The third layer is about relationships. The fourth layer is about esteem. And as I just mentioned now, the top one is your ability to reach your maximum potential. The original theory was that you basically, this was like what motivated your needs, yeah? So you once the basic needs were satisfied, you could move through the hierarchy up to the top. That was the original thinking. But of course, time moves on and people's understanding of psychology and sociology and human behavior changes. So now, even though it has some relevance, it does have some criticisms. One of the criticisms is that people don't move through the hierarchy. The needs may be happen simultaneously. Some of them are interrelated. Is one of the criticisms that come. It's not so linear, the process. And also some people like we think about Mahatma Gandhi. He did without eating. He went on starvation in order to get that higher level of enlightenment. So there's different ways of thinking about this. And the last one is that they say that the top tier is about what's missing from here is the spiritual needs, which would be beyond, which we did actually add into our survey. Yeah,
I still remember learning about this in university 20 years ago. So, how many responded to the survey, and how representative is it of Malaysian society?
Yeah. Well, we had over 2,000. Actually, we had close to 3,000 responses, but we filtered them because some of them were incomplete or the demographic data wasn't finished. So we ended up with 2,240 valid responses. this is a map of the density of responses, which at a glance, when you look at it, it is kind of reflective of the distribution of Malaysia's population. About 60% of Malaysia's population actually lives on the west coast of Peninsular Malaysia. So that sort of is partially reflected in this survey. So it's not. There's a little bit of a bias towards KL, a little bit of a bias towards Penang, as you would expect. The other bias, if we just move to the next slide, is that it had more females than males. It also didn't have so many young people. In relation, this is the graph on the left. You can see there the number of responses. There weren't that many under the age of 18, but we would anticipate that. I haven't got it here, but the ethnicity was relatively reflective of Malaysia. The thing that it wasn't reflective of is household income. We didn't actually ask the household income. We asked other questions about what type of housing did you live in, etc. So it didn't have that many responses in PPR flats or low-cost housing, but that's the nature of the survey game. You can't do an online survey and in a week expect to reach every group in Malaysian society. There is such a thing as hard-to-reach groups, and when you're doing a more rigorous process, you would have multiple types of surveys, and you would do that extra mile to reach out to those hard-to-reach groups. That said, it is still data. It's a big sample. So normally they talk of a sample of about 350 to 400 to sort of get some sort of representation sample. So it is representative of what I would call middle Malaysia. So it gives us quite good insights into middle Malaysia. That would be my response. So we need to be mindful that it's not fully reflective of the entire cross-section of Malaysian society, and there are certainly some of the results here need to be tempered when we think about some of the skewed data here. But as long as we're mindful of that and we don't making false claims, then I think it's a reasonable path moving forward. Apologies, Sean. I seem to have lost my internet connection for a short while.
Oh, welcome back. Okay,
sorry.
So I was asking you how many were in your team to help you go through the 1,000, filter to become 2,002 and analyze all of this.
Okay, so myself and my colleague Natalie O designed the survey. Then we got various people to cross-check it. One of my Malay colleagues, Ridwan, helped with the translation into a Malay version. Then there was lots of internal debate about, what was the right language to use, given that it was a mix of language. And then we had a team of about 3 go through the data and filter it, including the Think City Analytics team led by my colleague Celia. Went through all the data and cleaned it up. And then we looked at the data from just the raw data. Then we started to look at some of the relationships between different elements within the data. So I guess in answer to the question, probably about 6 or 7 people involved in it, but probably 2 or 3 people really sort of working quite intensely on it.
Okay. So what were the key findings of your survey?
Okay, so in the broad sense, remember this is Middle Malaysia only, respondents actually fared quite well, across a range of the various criteria we looked at, particularly in the sort of the lower level, the basic needs. But when we dug a little bit deeper, what we found is that different types of demographics were impacted in different ways, whether that be from age to gender, occupation. They were sort of some of the features that indicated that some groups did better than others. The other interesting finding we had was that a lot of the factors were interrelated. So where someone answered positively in one question, they tended to answer positively in a lot of the other similar related questions. And likewise, when someone had a negative experience or felt more stressful, then generally they were interrelated with other things like the ability to pay for rent and their mortgage and the utilities, etc. So that was sort of, in a broad brush, that was sort of the 3 main findings.
Okay. So is this the same for all the demographics?
No, it's not. As I said there, the second point, it's not the quite same. And I've got got a slide here that sort of looks at the Maslow's hierarchy against some of the key findings. Yeah? And on the left there, we have the thumbs up, obviously for a like, and the thumbs down for dislike. If we look at the basic level, yeah, what we found is that, as I said earlier, generally speaking, most people didn't have that much problem accessing food. But what we did find is that those with a stressful work environment, or those that were self-employed, or those that worked in a particular industry, did have some difficulty in some of those basic needs. As we move up the hierarchy, the majority of people had no problem paying their rent. But again, people in sales and the arts and the entertainment, so sort of the gig economy, if you like, those people who weren't able to access income because things weren't open, had a little bit more difficulty in that area. In terms of relationships, about half of respondents had felt good about their relationship with their family during MCO, but women there were some differences with men and women in terms of housework, and also some differences with younger people, which I'll talk a little bit about later. When I began to esteem, the older generations generally felt a little bit more positive during MCO, where younger age groups generally had a little bit more of a negative response. And when we moved to the next level, which is the potential one, people found that MCO was a time to reflect and for new skills and personal growth. But those under 25 and above 65 felt their achievements they didn't cite self-achievement as highly as some of the other groups.
So the survey also touched on childcare and parenting at home. My friends who had to balance working from home and also parenting at the same time found it quite difficult to cope. Did your survey reveal a similar trend?
Yeah. I'll just talk to this. Sorry, Sean. If we just go back one slide. If we just talk to this slide first. Sorry, this is a follow-up from the last one. It just reiterates the point there. On the left, what we have is a graph that looks at positive feelings. Yeah, during MCO, you can see there that feelings from excitement through to calm, and then the different shades of green represent different age groups. Yeah. So, take for example, if we take the column where it says calm, you can very clearly see that there is a relationship between age and people who felt calm. Yeah. So that this indicates the point that there were some demographic differences in how people thought about MCO. If we look at the right hand, which is in relation to the negative feelings, yeah. If we go, say for example, something like overwhelmed stress, right, which was one of the highest, you can see there that the older age groups didn't feel as overwhelmed as some of the younger age groups, yeah. And likewise with boredom, you can see the
younger
quite linear, but some of the younger group were a little bit more bored. They're not big differences, but if you look at them and combine them, it does sort of tell you something about how different types of age demographics coped with the MCO. Sorry, and then I'll just address your next question, which was, I believe, about
childcare.
Yeah. So we have three graphs here. The first one is about relationships, and there we see the bagus, which is obviously good, versus stress, and then we have male and female. Female being in light green and male in dark green. You just see there that women just felt a little bit more stressed about their family relationships, and men felt a little bit better about they're mild differences, but they are there. Then if we move to the middle graph, we can see that there is a difference when asked the question, did they feel that housework was shared equally? And we see there's quite a marked difference there between men and women, statistically speaking, this is, who felt men were more likely to say that they felt it was equal, whereas women were less likely to feel that it was equal. Yeah, and the similar kind of trend holds true for when asked the question whether they felt that childcare was equal or not. And these results are reflected elsewhere. I've looked at some other studies in Australia and the UK and different parts of the world, and there seems to be a similar sort of thing that has occurred during lockdown, this gender imbalance.
I guess the ones that complained to me, my friends, they are the women. So I guess it also reflects, is reflected in your survey. So humans being social beings inevitably suffered not being able to interact with family and friends. Did your survey show this behavior during the MCO?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, which is that there were certainly people who felt that they were stressed with the relationships, but it was kind of quite positive overall, you would say. If you look at the graph on the left, which is the percentage, this is for the whole sample, yeah, you can see that the vast majority felt that it was either bagus or same, whereas there was a much smaller percentage that felt that the relationships with friends were much harder to maintain. I'm sure it'd be different at a different time. We didn't have such good telecommunications and such. And then if you look at the right-hand side, you can see that, well, first of all, that about 10% lived by themselves, so the question didn't apply. And a small percentage said it was very stressed, and a larger percentage said they were a little bit stressed. So again, you can see that there was some levels of the majority. It was reasonable, but there were a group of people did find it stressed. And you'll find, if we go to the next slide, that this was particularly, again, different between age groups. Yeah. So if we look there at the hard to maintain, this is for maintaining friendships. Yeah. And we look at that middle one, which is hard to maintain. The darker colors of green represent an older age group. And again, we can see here that the younger age groups found that their friendships were harder to maintain during MCO. Yeah, and that some of the younger age groups also were less likely to say that it was the same.
I would think that, the younger being more technologically savvy and they like to be on their phones and their gadgets and things like that, will find it to be much easier to adapt to that situation. They can still connect through video calls and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that despite our concerns that young people spend far too much time on their phones, and in the digital world, when it came to lockdown, they really did miss the human connection. So it's interesting insight.
Yeah. So money is also a huge concern. With employees being laid off, businesses suffering from cash flow problems. What does your survey say about Malaysians meeting their financial obligations during MCO?
Okay, so if this set of graphs here is for the overall. The first one on the left is the ability to pay the mortgage, and again here we can see that the vast majority didn't have that much problem paying their mortgage or paying their bills during MCO. Yeah, with a much smaller percentage, around about 20%, 25%, having significant difficulties. But again, if we go to the next slide, you can see that there are these differences between groups. Yeah. So this is people who struggled. This is sort of taking that sample, and we're looking at sort of what sort of industry they worked in. And you can see here that those who struggled to pay their mortgage were more likely. 40% of them were up to 40% were in the sales and the arts, design, entertainment, sports, and media. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it, because these are the industries that were more likely to have layoffs, unable to go to work. You can't work from, well, some sales you can work from home, but you certainly can't work from home if you're doing retail sales over in a shop, right? And a similar sort of thing for the field of employment. If we go to the next graph, you'll see again that there is, next slide. And again, so this is again what I mentioned in the much earlier slide when you asked me about what the overall findings were. We spoke about there being interrelationships. Yeah. So here, what you can see is that you can see that those who found it difficult to access food, yeah, were across a range of. It was similar across a range of different areas. Yeah. Those who had a stressful work environment, yeah, were also less likely to be able to sleep. They had worse physical health, they had more difficulty paying the bill, they had more difficulty paying the rent, right? And they had more difficulty trying to balance work and childcare. So this is this idea of cascading or interrelated stress.
Yeah. So, what did Malaysians actually miss the most during MCO? So I guess the youngsters, they're missing their friends from
Yeah.
the earlier. So in generally, what do Malaysians miss the most during MCO?
Well, you know, to be honest, there's no real surprises here. Yeah? What do Malaysians miss most? They miss makan, right? And what they miss second? Going to the shopping mall. So no surprises here at all. But again, we see this this thing about the age, yeah, where actually there's a difference in the age groups here as well. Yeah. So moving through was sort of restaurants and makan, shopping, lepak in shopping malls, parks and open spaces, cinema, which was missed more amongst young people. And you can see the data as we go through here. Interesting, didn't miss concerts and theme parks so much, and festivals, or visiting tourist attractions, or sort of like what you consider high leisure. Just sort of the basic day-to-day things about being able to go to a restaurant and go to a shopping mall and the park seem to be the things that people miss the most.
Yeah. I don't find Malaysians to really like concerts and that much as compared to the Western part of the world. So maybe that's one of the reasons why you don't see that.
Sorry, Sean, I had a little bit of a difficulty hearing you there. I think you said.
Oh,
you may have to repeat the sorry.
Okay, I'll repeat what I asked. Actually, I was making a statement saying that Malaysians, I don't find them like going to concerts and those things as much.
True. That is also true. Yes. Yeah. More likely to go to the cinema or find entertainment in shopping malls or such things. Yes.
That's right. So at Taekwondo Penang, we see that happening as well. We have our counterparts in the Western countries, or even some parts of Asia. The families, they actually do bring their children to science centers and libraries, but we don't really see that happening in Malaysia that much.
Yeah, an interesting insight.
Yeah. Okay, so with all this data that you've collected, what happens now to the data which has been collected and analyzed?
So we've just finished the report, which is a lot more extensive than the graphs I've shown you, and we've released that today. So that's available for people that would like to view that. So that's just to get people talking about, in conversations like this, about how Malaysians fared during the MCO, people to reflect on the time and think about, hey, actually that's kind of true for me, or maybe they can think about ways in which they can take some of the lessons they learned during MCO and apply them into the future for themselves. That's sort of from individual perspective. We will probably also be looking at some of this data in the event that we need to go into another lockdown, or to look at what are some of the fallouts of the lockdown and the subsequent economic issues that may come out. We can sort of start to think about some of the policies that government may need to implement. One that comes to mind is, again, this the demographic that clearly young people didn't fare as well as some of the older age groups during the MCO. So that might be something to think about and reflect on in the, who knows, event that we need to go into some for other lockdown, either now or in the far distant future. And the third bit is that we consider this baseline data that we may be able to use in maybe 6 months' time. We may actually do something similar or a related survey just to see, because this was done just after MCO, right? Did people's perceptions change? Is their stress levels, have they endured? Did we get over it? How resilient are we? These sorts of things. So that's really how we will use the data over the next few months. So
Malaysians still okay or not?
I think okay. I think generally speaking, Malaysians are okay. I think, I haven't seen the latest ranking, but it's certainly ranked up there in terms of one of the countries that has done well to manage this crisis. Certainly, well, the latest article was in top 10 or top 12 of countries around the world in terms of managing it, both from a public health and from an economic point of view. And I think that really goes down, yes, the federal government and state government have done good things, but really I think it's the countries that have done well to manage this crisis. And certainly, well, the latest article was in top 10 or top 12 of countries around the world in terms of managing it, both from a public health and from an economic point of view. And I think that really goes down, yes, the federal government and state government have done good things, but really I think it's it's got to really come down to the Malaysian population. Yeah, who, my observation is, generally speaking, they've done very well to help flatten the curve. I believe I'm back now, Sean.
All right.
Sorry about it.
Sorry. Okay. So I mentioned just now that Ting City being under Khazanah, probably the federal government did go through your data, and then maybe some of the measures that the federal government has put in place was a result of your baseline data.
Sorry, the question is,
did the federal government use your?
Well, we've only just released the report today, so we part of our thinking with these sort of things is to encourage the broader public to have conversations about these types of issues, yeah, and thinking about, it's not just up to the government, right? It's also up to businesses, it's up to individuals, up to organisations to also reflect on this data and think about what that means for them moving forward as well, and how they might think about their own employees and their workforce. Organisations even like yourself may reflect on the data and think about how that may impact the types of things that you might do as an organisation moving forward.
All right, so let's go through some of the questions posed by our audience. From Dr. Kong, our CEO, do you have information about the key things Malaysia do while stuck at home?
Yes, we do. That was one of the questions. My recollection is that one of the main things that people did when they were stuck at home was to learn a new skill. Yeah, a lot of people did that. There was a lot of comments there about spending time with family. There was a lot of commentary there about cooking. There was a lot of commentary in there about reflecting on the past and on the future. Different for different age groups, but so I think spending time with family was the key thing that they did. Reading new books, obviously online, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's what I see from my social media feed as well, of what my friends and family do also. There's a lot of reconnecting with family members as well, or even friends that have been lost or been separated very far away already. Okay, we have another question from Joanne. Just wondering, what are these data used in?
Well, I guess that goes back to your final question, yeah? Similarly related, right? Is it? Yeah. So the answer to that is that we use these data to produce a report that's got a sort of a narrative about insights into Malaysians generally fared. And our purpose in the first instance is to allow people to look at that and reflect on it themselves and have conversations like this, so that organisations, governments, different institutions can think about the impact of MCO on Malaysians in general. We know that many people did well, but we also know that some people didn't do so well. So we need to be thinking about the long-term impacts on those groups particularly. If you think about, for example, people working in tourism or the arts or the gig economy, it's going to be some time before they're able to get back a livelihood, I would think. So there are certainly issues there. There are some things to reflect on there in terms of how younger age groups managed with the lockdown. So there may need to be some thinking around if that has any longer-term implications, or certainly if we, in the event that we had to go into another sort of MCO, maybe, I don't know, maybe one of the states does, or something, that this may be something that they think about in terms of making sure that there are counselling services or activities or things for younger people to release some of that stress. And I think the third thing is that we use this as baseline data that then we can use at some point in the future to look back on if we do another survey and see what the implications are.
Okay. We have another question from audience, from Stephen. Dr. Matt Benson, what is the age gap for those who deem MCO is okay and not okay? And what stress at home was stress at home higher during MCO per your data?
Yeah. If you recall one of the earlier graphs I put there, certainly the older age groups seem to be okay and less anxious than some of the younger age group, which is, totally understandable. It was a big event in Malaysian, well, the world actually, not just Malaysia. So it would have been quite overwhelming. There would have been quite a degree of uncertainty with certain groups. Trying to understand, well, what's this about? The first MCO was 2 weeks, then it gets extended 2 weeks, and another 2 weeks. So that would also cause, I would think, levels of anxiety in younger age groups who maybe couldn't quite understand the idea of how long it took, or weren't following the data, or those sorts of things, I would think. So hopefully that answers that question.
Okay. We have another question from Fitri. What is your advice to fresh graduated students in order to prepare themselves to be a good worker in the future?
Very, very good question. Well, I think that there's a couple of things here to think about and reflect on, which is that there's no going back to pre-COVID. Yeah, there's the new normal, and then there's the new normal. Yeah, so there's the new normal is now, which is where we deal with the pandemic, which is slowing in Asia Pacific, but accelerating in other parts of the world. We know that the economy is not going to be the same as before. It's going to be some time before tourism comes back. There's going to be some time before different parts of the economy fully open up and recover. Yeah, but where there is crisis, there's also opportunity. Yeah? I think it was the CEO of Microsoft talked about the fact that they'd achieved 2 years of technology take up in 2 months. Yeah, so there are certainly companies. The tech stocks have gone up. So there are opportunities in the sort of that part of the economy, and there are probably also additional opportunities in healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So there are winners and losers. So the answer to the question, that's a long way to answer the question, which is that have a look and think deeply about what are the opportunities in the next 2 to 5 years. Yeah, technology is going to be a big shift. There's going to be things around biosecurity, food security is going to be areas I would think about. I think the world's probably going to move a bit away from globalization. I wouldn't quite say they're going to move entirely into what we call localization, but we may be a bit more regional. Yeah, as the tourism industry opens up, it's probably going to open up in bubbles, travel bubbles. Yeah, Malaysia can then suddenly go to Australia and Singapore, but not to Europe, or maybe to Europe, but not to America or Latin America. So it'll probably open up in stages. And if you look at the sort of the maps of the index of recovery, it's definitely the Asia Pacific that is doing the best. And then there's the whole China-US trade thing. So coupled with all that, I think we can anticipate that the world going forward, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, will be probably defined by what we call regionalism. So it's not quite that you look east only, but the point being is that there are opportunities in this part of the world. I personally think that the Asia Pacific will probably do the best out of this. Possibly parts of Europe will also come out of it okay. So there are opportunities there. You just need to think about where you do your next level of study. So if you don't know how to use certain types of internet and software, then you should get on top of that, as an example. Broaden your skills, make yourself more valuable than any other of your graduate competitors.
It's interesting that you also noted about the localization of businesses and markets, because I recall mentioning this to one of the surveys done by MOSTI, the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. What would be the challenges in the next 5 years? So I mentioned that the localization of economies, that will be one of the challenges that we need to face. I also see this as like a reset button. We have seen those countries that suffered from SARS, Taiwan, Hong Kong. They are actually better prepared this time. They have already adopted wearing masks if you are sick. So they have the etiquette, the sharing spoon when you are having food together, for the same dishes. So I think they have already adopted that. So that's why the spread at their place is much better as compared to the rest of the world. So I guess the rest of the world now, they're actually learning all these things, and what I would say is that this new normal is here to stay, as what they have already done, Taiwanese, those at Hong Kong, they've done many years ago.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting observation. I think, well, the first thing I'd say is that if you look back in history, pandemics have been moments of significant change, right? Throughout history, from plagues through to various other significant smallpox, etc. They change behaviors, yeah? The question, though, is, you know, how much does that behavior change? Yeah? Would it be safe to say that the handshake is dead? Who knows? Will people still be doing namaste? You know, I think so, right?
Yeah.
So some cultural norms will change and some won't. It probably also comes down to, I guess, how long it actually lasts. Yeah, like I mean, there's already quite amazing, promising vaccine developments that have surprised me. I think 2 companies are now entering phase 3. In fact, there's like tens of thousands of people doing doing trials with vaccinations. I mean, that's quite remarkable, really. You know, with talk that even the first millions of doses will be ready by the end of the year, or in some cases even early September. So, I mean, obviously they can't do the whole world in that period of time, but if something like that happens and within 6 months it's all over, well, then maybe some of these cultural norms will go back. So that's what I would say about that particular element of the cultural shift. But I would say this, though, that taking your cue from the word reset, yeah, and coming back to the psychology of this, you know, coming back to Maslow's hierarchy, there was a moment there where we saw images, yeah, that we hadn't seen before, yeah. So when was the last time? Well, we've never seen images of you know, empty streets. We've never seen images of nitrogen dioxide. We produced a map ourselves to sort of show the difference between the middle of MCO compared to last year across Peninsular Malaysia. It shows a significant decline in nitrogen dioxide, which is produced by vehicle emissions. Right? So there are images like there was images of kangaroos jumping down the streets of Adelaide in Australia. So these sorts of images, these sort of may have a lasting effect. There's a famous image of what they call Earthrise, yeah? Which is the Earth rising out of the darkness taken from the orbit of the Moon, and they say that it's one of the most enduring and influential photos ever taken, and even some say that it sparked the beginning of the environmental movement, yeah, because it sort of showed the fragility of the Earth. So the point I'm trying to make here is that some of those images may actually be a reflection point for parts of humanity, for some of the ways that we view development, because this pandemic was not the result of an accident. This was a result. It was what we call an externality, yeah, of the modern industrial society. It happened because, for 2 reasons. 1, we push our human settlement systems into natural systems. And 2, we've created a hyper-connected, interdependent world, right? So those 2 factors combined is why we have this situation, right? It's not an enemy as such. It's not something that's out there. It's an externality. It's a consequence of our own system. So as we face increasing crises associated with climate change and such, then maybe these sorts of imagery and this data and these sorts of things may be a reflection point, and maybe it triggers or resets, as you said, some new thinking about the way we move forward. There's even talk of something called the New Green Deal gaining traction in Europe and in other parts of the world.
Okay. We have 3 more questions. First one from Dr. Kong again. I wonder how the students are doing with online learning. Perception about online learning seems to be negative. Did your studies looked into this? What are your own thoughts on this?
Well, it's an interesting question. I have read also some studies out there that are saying that it hasn't been effective. I would say the answer is it's not so simple. Yeah, I imagine that if you're a 7-year-old or a 12-year-old, I can't imagine it's been that effective. Right, online learning. It's probably just keeping you from falling backwards, right, over the last sort of a few months. But I would have thought things in the sort of higher education and vocational education, probably it's a different. I can imagine a future where a lot of courses are going to go online. Yeah? I can imagine a future where, the fact that people have got used to doing events like this online will change the way that they view and understand the way they learn, right? The way that they do webinars or courses or adult learning may have changed. Yeah, the fact that you don't have to enroll in a fancy university to learn something in a short amount of time. You can do a masterclass for a few $100s. Just even as just self-improvement, you may not get a certificate, but there are courses out there where allow you to do that. So in answer to your question, I think the answer is that, yeah, I don't think we want to be doing online learning for primary school. Maybe there's some benefits for high school, obviously not full-time, but certainly in some remote places. There's remote locations may have benefited from enhanced online learning. But I would have thought in a tertiary environment that the overall impacts would be quite positive in terms of accessing data, accessing courses, and accessing knowledge.
I did hear from my friends that their children in the early days of the MCO, when they started this online learning, they suffered a lot. It was very difficult for them. But in recent times, they've gotten used to it. Even their children knows how to log in themselves, when to turn on their devices and things like that. I also see it as a democratization of learning. So you're not restricted to the resources that you have within your community only. So you can actually access best teachers across not even the country, but in the world.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I guess particularly if you're not, there's a lot of free stuff out there. I don't know if you've seen this I looked at the Harvard website the other day. There was a lot of free online content. You could do 12 lectures by a Harvard University professor online, free. I don't know if they're doing it to sort of as a marketing exercise or what, but there's a lot of free stuff out there. And the stuff that you pay for, it's not that expensive. So you're absolutely right. It allows people to self-learn anyway, and self-improve, move up that hierarchy, if you like, based on their own motivation.
Okay, so the next question we have from Joanne. Any advice how to stay creative and productive during the MCO?
Any advice on how to stay productive and creative during MCO? Again, interesting question. I think that for some people, in our survey list, we found that there was a percentage of people, about 15%, who were super motivated and super creative during MCO. Yeah, they saw the experience as something where they were inspired to do something different, to write a book, to write essays, this sort of thing. So there was a certain group of people who actually just the moment itself, allowed them to feel more creative. So that's one point I would make there. The second point I would make is that, and maybe it comes back to your earlier point, which is that a lot of the free stuff that's out there, a lot of the online learning is quite inspirational and quite creative. I myself remember watching a masterclass on creativity and film, right, by a filmmaker, and it was all about how you talked about fishing for ideas. Yeah, you sort of threw a line out there in your imagination, and you caught an idea, right? And then when you catch an idea, you throw out another line, right? And then when you've got 20 ideas, you line them up and you catch another 50, and then you've got a film type of thing. So this idea of what's creativity, and I would have thought that MCO is a moment where you can reflect a bit and think, and you turn your imagination into catching ideas,
trying new things.
Yes.
Okay, we have another question from Tim. Dr. Matt, earlier you mentioned one of the main reasons Malaysia was able to flatten the curve relatively quickly in comparison with other parts of the world is due to how the Malaysian public handled the MCO. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between how Malaysians adapt to the pandemic versus the example of Western countries?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things here. I would say that well, first of all, many of you all remember SARS, right? So there was a sort of already an inbuilt thing about wearing a face mask, right? It wasn't something that you resisted doing. So that, you know, just a very basic, simple hygiene thing like that was not something that you struggled to do. I think Australians would have struggled more. I would have thought that Europeans struggled to do that. You know, it's taken some time for sort of that to become a behaviour that people are comfortable with. So that's one thing. Yeah, sorry, Sean. Friday night internet traffic, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So, yes.
I was talking about the comparison. So I was just now talking about face masks. I think that's more acceptable. The other thing I think that, well, like I said, you're more, you know, you're aware of these sorts of things. So there was a sort of some sort of cultural memory of these sorts of things. In terms of culture, well, you know. Well, I guess Malaysians are probably more likely to follow the lead of an authority. I take that the wrong way, but you know, there's lots of data around this that you, as a culture, are more likely to follow. Not follow is the right word. Listen to your elders. That's probably something that's less likely to happen in a Western country. So I think they're sort of some of the things that made the difference. You probably also, the other thing I think is that you went down into lockdown quite early, you know, compared to, I think you're about 2 weeks ahead of Australia. Australia's also been very successful in bringing flattening the curve for different reasons. Australia itself has actually surprisingly done quite well at actually the cultural practices, whereas places like in America, it's a lot more difficult, yeah, because people have, you know, the freedom, the rights, the way the country has evolved over a few hundred years, it makes it a lot difficult to tell people that they need to stay at home. Sweden, however, has tried another path, right? They've worked on the premise that there's a lot of trust between government and the individual, so they haven't gone into forced lockdowns. And my understanding also, I think there's some legal issues when they're actually being able to do that. So they went down the path of actually trusting the people to social distance. Right? So different responses for different countries. You know, China and another case altogether. So it really depends on the history of the place, the government system, and you're right, there is some cultural elements here as well.
So maybe we'll address the last question from the audience. From Fitri, under the MCO, students are worried about the academic schedules getting infected by COVID-19 and the situation at home. What is the best advice?
Well, my understanding is that depending on where you are, if you're in a school or in a college, you know, they've done reasonably well at sort of making sure that the disruption doesn't set you back too far, right? So this is the online learning. They've sort of had my own daughters have spent a lot of time online with their tutors and their teachers and their lecturers and their own tutorial groups. So there's been that sort of component. So the thing is to make sure that you actually continue to do that and not just sort of skip it, because you need to keep on top of this, because you know, a year of disruption. And you know, you maybe fall behind for the next year. The other thing I would say is that even though we're not in an MCO now, but you know, you could take the time to learn something else, as I mentioned before. Yeah, you could take the time to learn a new skill. Take the time to, you know, if you're doing a degree in psychology, then maybe you should, you know, if you're about Maslow''s hierarchy, then go off and learn a bit more about that. Yeah? So there, you know, so it's something that sparks your interest, and rather than just sort of sitting there playing Fortnite or a video game, which Sean did, right?
I didn't have time for that.
I'm sure, but the point is that, you know, don't waste the time, right? Because you know, this is an unusual time in your life, and make sure you get ahead of it rather than fall behind.
All right, thank you so much. Looks like we need to wrap things up. What would your advice be to all Malaysians now that we are in the RMCO phase, the recovery of MCO?
Well, I think the themes that emerged from the discussion this evening is that the first one is, you know, you've done so well after what, nearly 80, 90 days of some form of movement control. You know, you're not out of the woods yet, right? there's always the risk, as there is everywhere in the world, that you could have a second wave. So do your best to make sure that that doesn't happen. Yeah, follow the SOPs. Continue to social distance where possible for the time being. Monitor the news, all those things that you should do. Sanitize your hands, wear a mask, etc. So that's the first obvious thing I would say. The second thing is that we do need to get back to some sort of new normal. So let's try and do that in various different ways. Secondary school will be opening soon. So we need to do that in a way that doesn't mean that we are forced to go back down to some sort of lockdown. So again, let's get back to normal in a safe way. And probably the last thing I'd say is that if you're a business or a self-employee, as I was alluding to before, where there is crisis, there is also opportunity, right? So if you're a business, then you may need to be thinking about, is the old way of doing business really going to keep this business under? How long can I continue? But there's also ways you can pivot. There's ways of thinking about online. There are all sorts of different ways of creating an opportunity out of this. And so if you're a business, I would go looking for those to help not just get Malaysia back to normal, but also the economy and people's livelihoods as well.
Thank you so much, Matt, for spending your time with us the past hour. We thank you for your insights and hope you and everyone at Think City stay safe and healthy always.
Thank you, Sean. The same to you all at Penang Tech Dome.
Thank you. So were you okay or not during MCO? Although we are currently in the recovery phase of the MCO up till August 31st, please continue to practice the 3 Ws and avoid the 3 Cs. That's all we have for tonight. Thank you for being with us since 8 p.m. Do join us again next Friday on Science Stream, same time, same place. Good night and stay safe.